Hello friends, foes, and neutral parties. Today we are going on an adventure to the distant past, the 2000s. The modern internet lately has been making me feel nostalgic for a simpler time. And maybe it's because I keep consuming media from the 2000s, or maybe I'm tired of being an adult and want to relive my childhood. Or perhaps it's just because I miss having a nice online community for art. But I decided to scavenge the archives of a once beloved online art community for 20-year-old art tutorials. That's right, I went digging for tutorials on DeviantArt. What is DeviantArt? The short version is, DeviantArt is a site for artists and writers to upload their works to share with other creators. At least, that's what it used to be. Now it's largely overrun with AI images and dead accounts, and suffers from some really bad UX. There are still plenty of folks who upload their works, but the site is a shell of its former self. But in the 2000s, it was the place to upload your work. Original work, fan art, resources, you name it, it was there. I personally use DeviantArt to look at Zelda fan art and talk to my friends, as well as upload some really awesome MS Paint and GIMP artwork of my OCs. And while I don't use the site anymore, I'm still very nostalgic about my time with it. So, what am I doing here now? I thought it would be fun to find tutorials posted between 2000 and 2009 and follow them. Why am I doing this? I want to see if these old tutorials, some of them 20 years old at this point, are still relevant to modern digital artists, and because I think it would be fun to do. The plan is simple. I've broken up the art process into 6 parts and found a tutorial on DeviantArt from the 2000s to follow. The parts are line work, skin, eyes, hair, clothes, and metal. I'll include a link to each tutorial in the description if you want to read them yourself, but I will have them up on screen briefly as I get to each part. I'm also going to rank each tutorial out of 10 based on the following. 1. Is the advice good? Can you learn something from this tutorial? 2. Was the tutorial easy to follow and execute? Are the steps clear? Is the technique doable, or is it insanely convoluted and hard? 3. Is it still relevant advice? Can you use it in 2025? And 4. Do I like how it looks? Because I'm allowed to be biased about my own art. Alright, a couple quick notes about the concept here. I quickly designed an angel character because everything I drew in middle school had to have wings. I tried to design her with the aughts in mind, with accessories, belts, wings too small to be useful, and a chunky boot. I also pulled some inspiration from anime, giving her a strange hairstyle and teal hair. Lastly, I found a pose reference from my beloved Adorka Stock, who has been making stock images since 2007. I found a stock image from the 2000s that I felt fit the vibe of the piece. Okay, now that all of that is out of the way, it's time to actually follow some tutorials. First tutorial is on inking. This tutorial is by DeviantArt user Celeste, and it was posted in 2005. I'm not a big fan of doing line art. I find it very boring and tedious and difficult. And I know it's difficult because I don't do it a whole lot. And I don't do it a whole lot, so I find it difficult. I understand that. But regardless, I figured it would be a good challenge, and a lot of the tutorials following rely on having line art. They're very specific style with line art, flat colors, so on and so forth. So I had to have line work. As far as inking tutorials go, I think this one is very good. The actual advice in the tutorial is clear. It is good advice that you would find in a maybe more professional setting. As far as how easy was it to follow, it's written very clearly, and the tutorial focuses on one software in particular, but it can be used in any software of your choosing, doesn't matter. Is the advice still relevant? I believe that good inking advice never goes out of style. I think this is advice that you could easily use today. And do I like how it looks? Like I said, do not like doing line work, but I'll admit that I like how the final product looks. And I did use a different pen to ink than I normally use, which I think contributes to the quality of the line work, but overall, I give this tutorial full points, 10 out of 10. Our second tutorial is about skin, rendering skin, how to shade it, how to color it. This tutorial is by Uina19, and it was posted in 2006. This tutorial consists of using the lasso tool, which was a very popular tool at this point in time, I noticed, and using a soft eraser to soften the edges instead of using a blur or blend tool. Is this advice good? I think if you're after a specific style of rendering, it's very good advice. Also, the artist goes to point out the difference between soft edges and hard edges, which is used in even traditional painting. Is it easy to follow and execute? I'll admit that I struggled. I think I did it 2 or 3 times before I felt good about the results. The lasso tool is not something I use a whole lot in my work. This is a very different way of rendering than I am used to, but I still enjoyed the process, and I do think it looks really cool. Is this advice still relevant? I honestly think this could be a game changer for folks who want softer shading but don't know how to fully transition from cell shading to soft rendering. It's a nice in-between, and I think it could be a very good bridge to going from hard cell shading to full-on rendering. Finally, do I like how it looks? I really dig how it looks like a colored manga cover from the 2000s. It's very cool, very unique, and I did use it later in this same piece on the wings when I went to render them. This tutorial earns a 9 out of 10. It loses a point for being a little hard for me to figure out. And I get that that's user error, but I'm still gonna dock it just 1 point for that. Our third tutorial is this anime eyes tutorial by DeviantART user RayKit, also published in 2005. Is this advice good? I think this is a perfectly fine way to do eyes. It's not super groundbreaking, but it's not objectively bad. It's perfectly fine. Was it easy to follow? This was probably the easiest tutorial that I followed. It is very direct to the point, has lots of images, so it's very, very easy to learn what you're doing. Is it still relevant advice? It's not irrelevant, but I think eyes are one of the easier things to draw and render. The eyes look good, and you could definitely do this in a more modern program. But I still don't think it's groundbreaking. Finally, do I like how it looks? It's not bad. It's not how I do eyes in my personal artwork typically, but I don't have anything against it. It's a perfectly good way to do an eye. Overall, this eyes tutorial gets a 7 out of 10. It's not groundbreaking, but it's perfectly acceptable. The fourth tutorial that I'm following is this hair coloring tutorial by user Fiona Maria, posted in 2008. Alright, I'll admit, I had to do this 5 or 6 times before I finally figured out what I was supposed to be doing. So keep that in mind. Is this advice good? It leads to a very cool end result, and I don't want to call it bad advice because it's not, but it does have separate required reading to really understand what you're supposed to be doing. the artist links to a different tutorial on DeviantArt that tells you how to shade hair with a pencil, and that's the technique that you need to apply in order to achieve this tutorial. Was it easy to follow and execute? As I mentioned, I had to redo the hair 5 times. Part of that is user error, but the tutorial links to another tutorial, and I'm just a little bitter about it. I shouldn't have to read a second tutorial to figure out your tutorial. Does that make sense? Anyway, it was definitely the tutorial that I struggled following the most. Is it still relevant advice? I believe so. This tutorial is possible in any program with pin pressure and brush opacity. Do I like how it looks? I do. I genuinely think it is a very, very cool effect once you figure out how to do it. It's super cool, the hair looks very detailed, very shiny, very well rendered. But also, 5 tries. And because of that, this tutorial gets a 7 out of 10. Alright, our second to last tutorial is on clothes. This tutorial in particular is from a user named Snowchan, and this was posted in 2006. This technique relies heavily on the blur tool, and Procreate does not have its own blur tool. It has a smudge tool, but that is very different as it drags the colors around, and a blur tool, especially in Photoshop or another program 15, 20 years ago, would just smooth and soften the lines versus dragging the actual color around. So I had to make my own blur tool in Procreate. It is possible. It was just a little bit frustrating to get there. That's not the tutorial's fault. I just wanted to share. Alright, so, is this advice good? I don't have any issues with this advice. It's perfectly fine. It gives you different examples of folds and how clothing drapes on a body, which I think is good advice. That part there is very solid. Was this tutorial easy to follow and execute? Overall, I think it was pretty easy to do both. It took me a few practice runs, but honestly, it felt very similar to how I usually render, but instead of color picking, I was blending. Is it still relevant advice? This tutorial can be followed in any program with the blur tool. I don't necessarily think this style is in anymore. I think we've moved beyond blur tool as a society, but I wouldn't consider it completely irrelevant. And finally, do I like how it looks? I will admit I am not the biggest fan, and I think it tends to look muddy or soft in some areas. But I also think part of that is the subject of the painting. I like the smaller pieces, like the corset, the boots, the corset details, but the dress is too samey. I think if there were more wrinkles, smaller pieces, it would look less muddy. Also, the lighting I chose did not lend itself well to good shadows. That's also on me. That being said, I think a blur tool just always tends to look muddy. I'm just not a fan. That's a very personal take. I'm just not a fan of using a blur tool. Our final tutorial is a metal tutorial by a user called Real4Fantasy, and it was posted in 2005. Is this advice good? I feel like this is very good, solid advice on painting metal. It really makes sense to me anyway. And I feel like you could definitely take this and apply it to other types of metal, not just this gold. Was it easy to follow and execute? It's not the easiest tutorial to follow, and it relies more on showing than telling and the images it provides, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Is it still relevant advice? I believe this process can be done again in any program with opacity and pin pressure. And I think this is how I'm going to render metal going forward because it looks really nice. Finally, do I like how it looks? I'll admit I phoned it in on the chains around the waist and the neck, but the small pieces of gold where I did spend the time to properly render it, I think it looks really nice. I wish I had done the chains differently, just entirely, but at this point in the process I had spent about 18 hours on this piece and I was kind of ready to just be done. A last note about the background. I did find some tutorials to do a background, but I didn't find anything that really suited what I was going for. I ended up just kind of slapping something together without following any particular tutorial. I had done some looking, and I pulled some inspiration, but didn't actually follow the tutorials. I'll include them as like a special mention in the description, but I don't think it's worth talking about them here in the actual video. Alright, that brings us to our final piece. So, what have we learned? I think my biggest takeaway is that a lot of the advice found in these old tutorials is still relevant, and can pretty easily be replicated in modern software. Also, as trends change and come back around, I think there's a veritable treasure trove of tutorials that modern artists could peruse to replicate beloved art styles from the 2000s. I also think it's very cool to see what artists with less advanced art tools were able to create, and how they worked within the limitations of art programs at the time. Overall, I'm glad I took the time to collect and follow all of these tutorials. I can't promise I'll use any of them again, but it was a fun experience, and I feel like I learned quite a lot, especially because so many of these tutorials were very different from how I normally render my work. In all my research, I also found many tutorials from the 2010s, which is when I was properly online as a teenager. I'm thinking about trying this with another era of art tutorials, but let me know what you think. Anyway, thank you for spending this time with me today, and I hope you have a lovely evening.